years. I think I even joked about that the first time I was here. I was like, this will be a 3-part series, which was a joke because this is the only weekend we're here. And incidentally, I now have done a 3-part series over the course of 3 years, so not really setting any records here. But the first 2 times I talked about the Passover. I think the first time, I'm not sure, and how important that is. And then the second time I talked about God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, and how that's really just like the core of the Bible. And for the total grasp and understanding of the Scripture, you have to understand the eternal binding covenant that God made with Abram before he ever ushered in the Mosaic Law, before all the laws and regulations and sacrifices. He made a covenant with Abraham, not just to the Israelites, but he says, that all nations of the world will basically be in your offspring. And that will be in Genesis 22. So I have never really found a reason to leave Genesis. So I just keep reaching out of Genesis because I love it. And it's like, in the Old Testament is so important to, hopefully you can hear me okay, I don't know. The Old Testament is so important to understanding the Bible, but really just like the core, if you can just like read through Genesis over and over, that is like the core of understanding the Bible. Anyway, so where we're at so far with Genesis 22, which I find funny because it's called the sacrifice of Isaac, if you have like a subheading above the chapter, which is funny because Isaac doesn't actually get sacrificed, and I would have named it Isaac almost gets sacrificed. So it's like it's just funny. It's like, he's almost getting sacrificed, and we're like, oh, the sacrifice of Isaac. Anyway, so Genesis 22, at this point where we're at is we had the Garden of Eden, and I think I've mentioned this before, there's a giant promise made in the Garden of Eden that we can sometimes just skim over. He turns to Eve, so mankind has rebelled against God. The whole point was that they wanted to make gods of themselves, which is what the serpent tricked them into doing. He's like, hey, you can be like God yourself, which they weren't created to be like God. They were created in the likeness of God, not to be like God. And so they're like, yeah, maybe we can be like God if we just listen to the serpent. So they rebelled against God, and God he comes to them, he doesn't destroy them, he's not mad at them. He says, he curses the world because that's what happens when you sin, is the world is cursed because, there's a lot there. You distance yourself from the giver of life, so then when you distance yourself from the giver of life, there's nothing but death, right? That's just like kind of a summary of that. And so he turns to Eve, or rather he turns to the serpent, and he's like talking to Eve and the serpent. He's like, this woman, Eve, is going to have an offspring, singular, offspring. And then he turns to the serpent, he's like, you will bite his heel, but he will crush your head. And that's kind of how the Garden of Eden scene ends. Which we kind of like, okay, it's like metaphorical, but he's telling the serpent, who is representative of Satan, and he tells him, like, one day this lady is going to have a child, and her child's going to have a child, and eventually it's going to be someone who will crush your head, but he will also bite your heel. So he'll kill you, but you'll also kill him, right? And so that's where we're at now, is like God promising someone to come and crush this serpent who's caused evil to come into the world, and we move on, and it's like, it just keeps getting worse, and then the flood happens, and God like wipes out everyone on earth that's evil, right? Because everyone on earth is evil, including Noah and his family. And then we have this hope that maybe Noah is the Messiah, right? It's like maybe Noah is this sent person who's going to crush the serpent. And then after all the evil on the earth is destroyed, Noah then goes and he sins and kind of turns against God for a moment. And then comes back, though. But that's like kind of showing. It's like, no, it wasn't Noah. It wasn't Adam. It wasn't, it's not Moses. It's not David. It keeps going and going, and people thought it was David. And it's like, and finally, eventually we get to the gospel, and it's like, one out of the wilderness comes, and it's, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. But it's kind of a theme. It's like throughout Genesis, like, who is it going to be? Joseph. Like, who is it going to be? And so, mankind rebels against God. God's like, okay, maybe it's like showing us, like, look, if I kill all the sin in the world, and then you'll have children, and there's still going to be sin here. Like, this is a deeper problem than an external, physical, what you're doing. It's like a problem deep within your heart that sin is. And so sin gets worse, and we have the, which is just Garden of Eden all over again. Every story is just the Garden of Eden over again, right? It's like them building a tower up to heaven. They're like, we're going to make gods of ourselves. We're going to build all the way up to heaven. And you think God would, like, slap their tower and crush it. And he's like, I'll just confuse your language. And it's like God came down to the tower, showing like how distant he still is from it. He's like, I'll just confuse their language, and they can't build. And it worked. He didn't have the kids. He's like, look how weak. And he calls them children, even though they're adults, right? He's like, look, I'll just confuse their language, and they can't do anything. And so that's where we're at now. And then God made a covenant with Abraham that. First he said, you'll have a child, and he makes a covenant with him, an eternally binding covenant that all the nations of the world will be blessed through him. So in Genesis 22, something really, why I think we kind of skim through the Old Testament and some people don't like it that much. A lot of the stories are really vacant of emotion. What I mean by that is we're very Western Greek minded, meaning if I were to tell you a story, I tell you this happened and this happened and this happened and I felt this way and I reacted like this and I did this and this is how they felt, and you're adding all this stuff, and so there's no need to ask any question about the story because I've told you everything. But when stuff happens like Abraham and Isaac, he's going to sacrifice Isaac. He doesn't put, and Abraham was super sad and Isaac was terrified and all this. Doesn't add that because it assumes you'll fill that in and wants you to think about being there and filling that in yourself. So it's vacant of emotions that you will fill that in yourself. And there'll be another example of that later. But Genesis 22, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. I mean, even that, like before we even get to the story, it's like, I love that. It's like, God tested Abraham. It's not like a secret. It's like, hey, this story is written so that you can see how God tested Abraham. It's not some confusing thing we got to figure out. It's like, hey, this is the test of Abraham to see if his faith is something super important is that this is not what made his faith. Like, he doesn't do this, and now he has faith in God. Earlier in Genesis 15, it had already said, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So he is righteous before God because he believed, and now it's time for the test. So, if you're, a new Christian or you just don't know, being a Christian, being a follower of God does not mean you are free from being tested. God will test you, and I think that we don't like the idea of God testing us, right? Like, no one likes to be tested. But, if you read James, it's like, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. It's like, when you're tested, don't only withstand and endure. He's like, count it as a gain and positive, and count it as a joy when you're tested and meet trials of various kinds. And then in 1 Peter says, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening. He's like, not only be mad, he's like, don't only not be mad, he's like, don't be mad, count it as joy, and then don't be confused when it happens, because you know what's going to happen, because this is what happens when you follow God, is you're tested for your faith. And I think that he tests us to prove our faith to be genuine, or to be more genuine. You don't gain a faith through testing. You have a faith and then it's tested. The way I think about this is when gold, the image that Peter uses is gold, when it's refined into fire, it's burned, it's melted, the impurities of the gold rise to the top, they can scrape that off, and then you keep doing that over and over as pure as you want the gold to be. But what's fascinating is that what we don't think about is the gold is becoming more and more valuable every time you put it through the test of the fire. Yes, that's a great metaphor for sin, and you're put through the test. That goes away. But it's like the gold is becoming more and more valuable every time you put pressure and heat and you put it through the test. It's becoming more valuable, and it's not changing what it is, but it's just becoming more valuable in and of itself. And when we're tested in a situation like Abraham, there's 2 things we can do that we can always do, right? We can be faithful to God and lean into God, right? Or we can be fearful and try to lean into ourselves and try to trust in ourselves. And that's really what the whole story of the Bible is. It's Adam and Eve. It's like, okay, you're going to trust what God's saying. Is you're going to trust what I'm going to tell you? You're going to trust what Satan's telling you. You're going to listen to yourself. Like, they wanted to become like God, and God's like, no, don't do that. Listen to what I'm saying, and they did it. They trusted in themselves. And the whole point of it is are we going to trust God and who God says He is? And that's kind of what I see in the story of Abraham and Isaac is, yes, it's an act of obedience and faith, but it's Abraham trusting in God and who God says God is. And then to kind of get into the story, verse 4. It says on the 3rd day, so they traveled 4 days, right? They didn't. Also, if you kind of think about the story, we probably have a really a different perception of what the story would look like. So they didn't just go outside and do this. They traveled for 3 days to get there. So it says on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy, referring to Isaac, will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they both went, both of them together. So, I mean, can you imagine what Abraham's thinking right now? What just missed by just jumping into 22 is the promises that God had just made Abraham, right? So in Genesis 15, he promised, like, hey, Abraham, you're going to have a son, and then all of the nations of the world will be blessed through your son who's eventually going to come. And then they eventually, like, laugh in the face of God. Like, his wife Sarah laughs in the face of God. She's like, he's like, oh, he's over 100 years old. And he's like, I'm going to have a son at 100 years old, right? I mean, can you imagine being 100 at all and then having a son when you're 100 years old? It's like, so she laughs in the face of God, and then eventually, it's God. So when she has a son, then they name him Isaac, which means he laughs. So to play on words for her laughing in the face of God. So his promise was not only that you would have a son, his promise was to Isaac. He said, you will have a son, you will name him Isaac, and through Isaac, not anyone else, not through a second son, through Isaac, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And now he says, okay, Abraham, go sacrifice Isaac. And you're like, I mean, if you're reading through Genesis at this point, you're like, what's going on? Like, how are you going to sacrifice Isaac? He just made promises to Isaac. So if you can imagine what he's thinking right now, I think he's just scared. I mean, he's confused, really. And sometimes I think that's true. It seems like what we see versus what God is telling us is reality are very different. And they're two seemingly different things, right? Like, it's hard being on this earth and then constantly looking forward to our hope of heaven. And it's like, man, and then sometimes you're just like, is this all? Like, you just start struggling and doubt. You're just like, it's like, because what I see seems sometimes a whole lot different than like what's in this Bible, right? Or what God's telling me. So I think that's just like a part of the big test. It's like trusting in God and who God says He is, and that God is that will tell you the truth versus what you actually see. But anyway, they travel for 3 days, and they finally get to the place where he's going to sacrifice Isaac. So, but there are all these preceptions, right? So Isaac can't die, because if Isaac dies, then God didn't keep his promise, then he's no longer God, and he's a liar, so then that can't happen, right? So Isaac can't die, at least he can't remain dead. And we know that God is not a God of human sacrifice, so it's like, seems very contradictory for him to go tell Abraham to sacrifice his one and only child, whom he loves. And then the third confusing thing is God just asked him to sacrifice Isaac. So, I mean, if you can sense the confusion of Abraham going up, and then if you're trying to get into the mind of Abraham, we're blessed with this book called Hebrews, and it tells us what Abraham was thinking. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So, we get to see what's in the mind of Abraham, 3,000 years later, going up to this mountain to sacrifice his son. He's like, at the very least, he knows the nature of God, and he trusts in the nature of God, and who God says he is, that God just created the whole world out of nothing. So if I sacrifice my son, surely God can at least raise him from the dead, because God, one, has to fulfill his promises, and two, he's able to create and bring his son back from the dead. So he's going up the faith of Abraham, like going up fully expecting, hey, I got through with this guy from the dead at least, because he has to fulfill his promises, because he's God. Finally, Isaac starts to catch on. You can sense the kind of the awkwardness in the story. He says, I and the boy will go over there. And it's very important. He says, me and the boy will go over there. We will worship. This act of sacrifice is worshiping God. And we will both come back to you. Not I will come back. Because we will both come back to you. So he's very confident that God will do what he says he can. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Isaac said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. I mean, you can see the awkwardness in the story. Isaac's catching on to what's going on. He's like, this is starting to get a little weird. We have fire, and we have a knife and wood, but we don't have a lamb was the common sacrifice. Like, okay, we're going to sacrifice a lamb. So he asked God, he's like, where's the lamb? And I asked Abraham, where's the lamb? And Abraham responds, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. So Isaac's carrying the wood up the mountain to his own sacrifice, and I think I think in this moment, Abraham's really speaking prophetically without knowing it. He says, God will provide, and it's very important, it says God will provide for himself. Like, not even for us, God will provide not even for you. God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering. And if you don't see the gospel implications of that, just read the Bible more. I think you just need to read the Bible more. Because it's like, if you don't see the story of the gospel in that sentence, then I don't. Just read more, right? That'll really solve that problem. So I believe Abraham's speaking prophetically. The lamb metaphor is actually like a double typology, because it's like, he's like, we'll provide a lamb eventually when, I'm assuming you know the story, Isaac gets saved, there's a ram caught, they sacrificed a ram, but he said a lamb, not a ram. But they sacrificed a ram. So what they pointed forward to is like, oh, he meant the Passover. So eventually when they were in slavery in Egypt, they sacrificed a lamb, because God says, whoever doesn't have the blood of a lamb on their doorpost, I will pass over. It says, I will pass over, and their firstborn son will die, to Egypt and to Israel. And so that's pointing forward to that. But that was pointing forward to Jesus. So this is like a double, like skipping towards Jesus. So eventually this is pointing to Jesus. But in this moment of Passover, and he has no idea that any of this is happening. I think he's just saying this without having any clue that, like, he's proclaiming that God will provide as himself, for himself, to himself, the lamb that will be slain on our behalf, which is why I had you read out of Revelation 5, because that's saying, worthy is the lamb, who is God, who everyone's bowing down to open the scroll of God. It's just a beautiful image that he has no idea he's saying. And he says that God will provide for himself, which is a beautiful, because they name this mountain eventually, the Lord will provide. And the Lord does provide. He provides for himself what we can't provide. So they go up the mountain. I'll just read it. It says, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him up on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. So, crazy story. We kind of just like skim through it, like it's kind of grown old on us. Like, he's going up and he ties up Isaac and they lay the wood down. They light a fire for the burnt offering, right? And he's going to, the kids are gone, so he's going to cut Abraham's neck like a lamb. There's kids here. It's like, he's going to offer a sacrifice. Like, the Bible's a vivid story. Like, it's not like rainbows and sunshine. Like, he's about to, kill his son. And he's like, and then the angel's like, Abraham, wait. And I'm sure it's like, oh my goodness. God came through, right? God is who he says he is. And he says, I know that you love me, so go sacrifice this ram over here caught in the thicket. And again, if you don't see also the gospel implications of that, you just need to read more. Isaac was going to die, but God provided a substitute for his payment, which is like the basis of the gospel message at the very least. So the whole point of the story is that Abraham is trusting in who God says God is, right? It's like trusting in not trusting in God, but trusting in God's word, that God is who he is and that he will be who he will be. Because God promised children to Isaac and blessing the world through him, and God's not going to break his promise. Even if you ask me something crazy, like, hey, go sacrifice Isaac, he's like, but you told me you will keep your promise, so I will go up there and I'll hold a knife above him. Even if that means killing him and you raising him from the dead, I'm still going to do it because I know that he will at least come back to life and you will bless me with offspring through him. And it's amazing that God says, I know that you love me because of this. Because if you think about it, to love is to sacrifice. When people are like, what is love? It's a feeling, it's emotion. Yeah, not really. It can be driven by a feeling, emotion, but it's not in and of itself an emotion. People are like, well, love is a verb, love is an action. Well, yes, but if you dig a little deeper, it's like, what does it mean to love someone? And I think the very basis, it means to sacrifice for someone. It's not always your son, but it's to sacrifice on someone's behalf. It's like, you can sacrifice your time, you can give up your money, you can sacrifice, your plans, your afternoon, you can sacrifice small things, you can sacrifice big things, right? Big things that hurt, big things that you actually feel a lot deeper than just giving up a few dollars or giving up a few hours of your time. To show someone love is to give up something that you otherwise would have kept. right? So Abraham's saying, like, I am willing to give up this son on your behalf. Which, if we had read the story up to this point, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, were willing to do anything they could to get this son. Now, Abraham was not, yes, he was a righteous before God, meaning he was justified before God because he had faith in God. But he was not a good person. He was, they had a slave, and he was like, he got impatient, waiting for the Lord to give him a son. So the word that used for him, he then went and had a son with, had a child with his slave girl, right? And the word is that he abused her. Like the word is the same, he oppressed her and abused her. And it's like the same word used for when Pharaoh oppressed the Israelites. It's like, no, he wasn't just like, oh, it's just our employees. Like, no, he abused her, like in ways that we cannot talk about, right? It's like ways that you would be in prison for now. And it's like he's doing everything he can to get the son. He's ruining other people's lives, getting in the way to get this son, right? And then God finally gives him a son. He goes, now go give it up before me. Go sacrifice it to me. Right? And that's what he does to us. It's like we're so willing to do these things, we'll do anything to like get ahead and to take control. And God's like, okay, are you willing to go put that on the altar before me and sacrifice it and hold a knife above it and give it up to me? They've done everything they can to get the son, and now God goes and asks him to sacrifice it. Why? Because he wants Abraham to trust in God and not the gifts that God gives him. Because sometimes what distracts us the most from God is exactly what God is giving us. We're like praying to God, like, give me this, please, 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 give me this. And it's like, if I give you that to you, you're not going to love me anymore. He's like, if I give you this, it's just going to hurt our relationship with each other. And that's, I think, what this story is saying is like, he's doing everything he can to get the son, and finally he has the son, and God's like, okay, do you love me, or do you love the gifts I give you? Do you love the promise that I'm going to give you, that their offspring will be a blessing to the whole earth, or do you just love the gifts I give you? And I think it's the same thing for us. So we can put ourselves in Abraham's shoes. Do we actually love God? Do we like the feeling God gives us, like the emotional high that God can give us, right? Or we love God? Are we willing to give up and sacrifice for God on his behalf? And what do we sacrifice? Are we able to sacrifice more every day? I mean, I think it's a rhetorical yes. I think as Christians, it's super important to be characterized as sacrificial people that are always willing to give up their, like you asked them, and on a whim, they'll say, yes, my afternoon is yours, my money is yours, my time is yours. Like, you need someone to talk to, I'm always there, always willing to give up and sacrifice something for someone else. Now, I'm going to link that. Gotta check my time. This new thing we're doing, if I preach on the Old Testament, I try to link it to a gospel, and link that to the epistle. So let me know if you like. First time trying it. Luke 9:57, right? I'm going to flip it actually. I don't want to mess it up. All right. It's these people coming to Jesus, and the subtitle says the cost of following Jesus. And I'll just read it. It says, as they were going along the road, someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus replied to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. To another, he said, follow me. But Jesus replied, Lord, let me first go bury my father. And Jesus said to him, leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as far as you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Yet another said, I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at home. Jesus said to him, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. And that's it. Right? What happened to these people? Like I said, when stories are vacant of emotion, that's on purpose, because they want you to fill in that vacuum when there's nothing there. And we're kind of just like man, he's right. We're kind of like, man, Jesus is kind of harsh. Like he just wanted to go bury his father. And it's like, hey, he just wanted to go say bye to the people at home. And that is exactly telling of the story that Jesus is trying to tell, right? It's like first let me go bury my father. And she's like, no. Like, if you go back home, like that means you don't want to follow me right here, right this second. You're not willing to give that up. It's like, you love them more than me. He's like, go. And we're just like, whoa, Jesus, calm down. But isn't exactly what the story is about? He's like, look how we react if Jesus were to say that to us. Like, okay, first, let me graduate high school, and then I'll really be faithful. It's like, first, let me get the job I want, and then I'll really study the Bible, and dive in and really study that. It's like, God, let me first retire. First, let me do this, and then finally I'll follow you. And he's like, no one who puts their hand on the plow and looks back, no, they're not fit to follow me. If you look back, you have no place here. Jesus is like discouraging people of following him more than he's encouraging people to. People are like, they're like, Lord, can I follow you? He's like, sure. It's like, first let me go home. He's like, no, we don't have where to sleep. When I lay your head, if you're not willing to give up where you sleep, you're not fit to follow me. And the guy walks away, and he's not like, no, wait, it's not that bad. Come on, come back. He's like, Jesus is like, no one who puts their hand in the plow and looks back is fit to follow me, right? And he's like, they're not willing to sacrifice, like saying bye to their family, their career, not willing to sacrifice these things. And then our reaction is, oh man, Jesus is kind of harsh. That's the harsh side of Jesus, you know. He's all love, you know. The harshness it's a lot less. No, he's like, are you willing to lift up your hand and sacrifice that on the altar before me, like Abraham did? And there's no reaction in that story because it's to see how you react, right? I think that he purposefully did not put a reaction because like the rich young ruler story says, and he went away sad. And because the point of that story isn't how you would react. I mean, there is a point there, but it's like the point of this story is like, how would you react if Jesus said, no, quit your job and go do this instead? And it's like, oh, well, would we go away sad? Or was it like, yes, I can't wait. Like, I know Abraham, like, I know you gave me a son. I'm willing to sacrifice him because I love you, not the gifts you give me, right? So finally, if you think about the story of Abraham and Isaac, who is this story about, right? It's about God. It's the easy answer. The whole Bible is about God. It's about Abraham. It's about Isaac. It's about the goat, right? The ram. What I've learned in the past few years is like there's one piece to this story that really unlocks it and makes it make sense for me. I think for everyone. It's if you picture the story in your head of like a painting or like a TV show. I don't know, Abraham and Isaac, right? Them going to sacrifice. I mean, so I'll give you a hint. Abraham's over 100 years old when he has Isaac, so he's much older now. How old do you picture Isaac, right? Second question is, how much wood is required for a burnt offering? The answer is a lot, because especially to sacrifice a human, it's a lot of wood, right? So he carries multiple people. It says there's 2 young men with them. Why? Because there's a lot of stuff to carry. There's a lot of wood to carry, right? So I don't see Isaac as a little toddler carrying a bundle of sticks up the mountain while a donkey is not doing the hard work, and these 2 young, because they told the other men to stay, right? He brings Isaac up the mountain holding the wood. And the Hebrew word used to describe Isaac is, in yours it might say lad. It was like me and the lad will go up and worship and come down. That word is a young man. It's the same word to describe the other 2 people that are with him, right? We don't picture them as little boys. We picture them as at least 20. It's the same word used to describe Jacob. When Jacob was 17 years of age, he was, and it uses that Hebrew word. So would you picture Isaac at least 17? Maybe older. I'm willing to go up to 25 or 30. Then it's important. I promise that's important. Because what's the point? Because the point is if he's old, if Abraham's really old, right, and Isaac's really young, and he's not, he's not like a weak guy. He's carrying wood. He's cutting wood. He's a shepherd. Like he's not out of shape. Like he's a strong guy, and his dad's 100 years old. How on earth would Abraham tie him up and bind him without Isaac wanting to do so? Right? What's the point? We see Isaac as a little boy, and if you take him out of that context of being a little boy that I think we've kind of incorrectly learned, there's a small cultural detail of how much wood is required for a burnt offering, and it's a lot. So if Isaac's carrying all that wood up the hill, obviously he's a lot older. The Hebrew word to describe this for a young man, obviously he's a lot older than a young boy, than a little boy. So what's the point is, have you heard of this story before? A young man, a man, is with his father going up, carrying his own wood for his own sacrifice, orchestrated by his father to sacrifice himself to God. Have you heard that story before? Right? It's Jesus. Like he's carrying his own wood up the hill to sacrifice himself to God because his father orchestrated it. And I don't think Abraham wrestled Isaac and tied him down. I don't think that's the image God's trying to portray. Is that Abraham put his own son in the headlock and tied him up and held the knife. And Abraham screaming, or Isaac screaming, and God's like, wait, stop. No, I think it's Isaac putting out his hands saying, here. Exactly like Jesus did. He says, here. He says, tie up my hands. Right? That's the story that God is trying to tell us through Abraham and Isaac. It's not like Abraham wrestled Isaac, and I know Isaac didn't want to do it, but God did it anyway. It's like Isaac's like, this story's about Isaac. He's like, you can take me and sacrifice me to God because I trust you and I trust God. I think that story sounds super familiar to me. I don't know if it sounds familiar to you. But the end of the story is definitely very familiar to me. Also upon that, what was the ram caught in? It was caught in a thicket. You know what a thicket is? A thorn bush. What was on Jesus' head? A crown of thorns. He's like, look, the substitute for you, Isaac, it kind of shifts from where Isaac is Jesus to where Isaac is now us. He's like, you're not the lamb. Says God will provide a lamb to himself. Isaac, you're not the lamb, but the lamb is coming. So he paints this image and he stops and says, now, this is what you deserve. but this is what Jesus is going to get one day. And he doesn't provide a lamb, he provides a ram. And a ram's stuck in the thorn bush. And Jesus eventually put on a crown of thorns, hailing himself as king. The importance of this eventually leading to an image of the Passover. Leading to an image of the Passover when the Israelites were in slavery for 400 years. God says, tomorrow night, if there's not the blood of a lamb on your doorpost, every firstborn child will die. And it's the importance of, it's not, every firstborn child in Egypt will die. It's yes, every firstborn child in Egypt will die if they're not under the blood of this lamb, but it's every firstborn child in Israel will also die. And that was a clear message to them. It's not like, yes, you're my holy chosen nation that I love, Israel, but you're also not safe. You also need a sacrifice. Me loving Israel is not enough. It's you need someone to pay. Someone has to be sacrificed. And every firstborn son who woke up the next morning on the Passover, the first Passover, the only reason they were alive, and they know this. They look and they're like, the only reason I'm alive is because there was a lamb that died in my place, right? And this is what that was pointing to, which eventually points to us. The only reason that we will not die, the only reason that you will not die and be separated from God is because a lamb died in your place. And I think that is then, Paul says in Romans 12, he says, therefore, by the mercies of God, live your lives as a living sacrifice. Like, present your bodies, your own bodies, as a living sacrifice. Now, sacrifices don't live. That's the whole point of a sacrifice. You're a living sacrifice, which is an intentional oxymoron. It's like, be a living sacrifice. You know the problem with the living sacrifice is that it's always crawling off the table. And you always have to bring it back, and bring it back, and bring it back, and sacrifice it again, and again, and again. And it's not easy, but it's like over and over. Abraham was tested over and over, and we're tested over and over. And we have the opportunity to bring that living sacrifice back on the table and sacrifice ourselves to God all over again, just like Isaac did. So think about this week, how Isaac just offered himself as a living sacrifice to God and submitted to his father's will and gave himself up to whatever God would have him do. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word and preserving it for us. I pray that we would understand it, God, and that you would show us the meaning behind everything you've written, God. We pray for understanding that that anything I said that is not aligned with your word, God, that did not come from your word will be forgotten, God. That anything I said that did come from your word, God, will be remembered forever. And take root in our heart that we would obey it and trust in God. Show us more where we can sacrifice this week, God. Show us more where we can give up and sacrifice and give ourselves to you, God, like Isaac did. We love you so much, God.